Turning our attention now to the latest report from the EU Asylum Agency. We're going to discuss it with France 24's Douglas Herbert. Doug, the report suggests that the coronavirus lockdowns are making it even harder for would-be asylum seekers to reach Europe, but we're also told that the pandemic may trigger a bigger migrant wave in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely, Claire. There's a sort of 1-2 punch in this report. The severe restrictions that most EU countries have placed on their borders, their controls in response to the coronavirus has basically, like you said, made it a lot harder for would-be migrants, asylum seekers, to get to Europe to file their applications. So we've seen a really dramatic drop, and I mean dramatic, almost nearly half drop from February, when you had almost more than 61,000 people applying for asylum across Europe, to just under 35,000 in March, a really big drop. And what is happening at the same time, though, is this agency, and it's called the European Asylum Support Office. It's a part of the European Union. It's warning, okay, the numbers have been reduced in the short term, the here and now, but watch out down the road, because if you have coronavirus outbreaks in some of the countries through which the migrants and asylum seekers often come, throughout the Middle East, throughout Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that could spark in those regions food shortages. It could spark more destabilized security. It could also strengthen the hand of militant groups, such as the Islamic State. All of those are factors that could could drive a surge in refugees, in migrants to Europe. So yes, a short-term drop in the numbers, but in the medium to longer term, this very pandemic, which has closed the borders to a lot of migrants now, made it harder for them to get to Europe, could still spur a further wave of migration in the months to come. Obviously, it probably will not get back up to the numbers that we saw back in 2015, when almost more than a million migrants surged into Europe, leading Europe to sort of clamp down the entire bloc, literally paying off Turkey, Libya, billions of euros in order to try to have those countries keep the migrants at bay. We won't see those numbers likely, but the pandemic is not over, not by a long shot, and it could still have repercussions down the road in terms of heightened waves of migrations coming from sub-Saharan Africa and other places as well. Syria, Afghanistan, which is also the source, 2 countries where a lot of asylum seekers come from.
Doug, coronavirus may be pushing numbers down, but it seems that most African migrants remain determined as ever to get to Europe despite the pandemic.
More determined than ever, you might say, Claire. In the words of one former people smuggler who was quoted by a group called Info Migrants, and they devote themselves to interviewing migrants, getting information. They said the sentiment among a lot of the Africans who make their way through sub-Saharan Africa, often using Libya eventually in northern Africa as a jumping off point to try to cross the Mediterranean and get to Europe. It's basically, I would rather die from coronavirus than live in misery here in my country in Africa. Take a country such as Niger. Niger, one of the key transit countries for sub-Saharan African migrants. Also, one of the world's poorest countries. Niger is right now a low number of coronavirus cases, but its government has still declared a state of emergency in the country. Soldiers are posted along the borders with its neighbors, with Libya and Algeria, and making it very hard for migrants. It was already difficult to cross the country to try to get to the sort of posting stations on the border to get into Libya. And Niamey, which is the capital of Niger, is all but cut off from the rest of the country due to coronavirus measures put in place. And a lot of would-be asylum seekers, migrants trying to make that journey to Europe would pass normally through the capital for support en route to the border, to Libya. So, and Niger is just one country among many where it is a much more difficult and treacherous journey, with soldiers now tightening security, slowing down their journeys, but they are still determined to make it. They are still determined to somehow get to Europe. So yes, a slower journey, a more treacherous one perhaps, in the desert heat perhaps, but they're still doing it. And just one last thing I'll leave you with, not only are they still in the desert, but because they are being slowed down, there's now the International Office of Migration, the IOM, is actually appealing for an extra $10 million in order to help those would-be migrants trying to come to Europe, stranded, literally exhausted in the desert, not able to make it further, to set up some facilities to help them where they're unable to move any further. to try to make that already treacherous journey a little more bearable, if not literally to help them survive. So watch this space literally, because the African migrants, their lives, for a lot of them, they say they're just so miserable that anything is worth it. Anything, a treacherous journey through searing desert heat, even under the conditions of a global pandemic and stepped up security by soldiers in their own countries in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you, Doug. Douglas Herbert reporting there.